Hello, hello. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Thank you everyone for coming. It's really nice to have you all. So welcome to our presentation about effective risk reporting strategies. Would just like to start with some introductions. I'm Roopam Chandi, a manager with PwC Cybersecurity and Privacy Practice. I've had 7.5 years of experience in consulting, Big Four consulting, specializing in cyber strategy, risk management, compliance, working with different industry sectors. So I worked with consumer markets, FS, healthcare. Neetika.
Yep. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session today. I'm Neetika Bhargava. I'm Senior Manager with PwC, and I have over 7 years of experience in cybersecurity, and I have experience over different industry vectors like financial services, public sector, and utilities. We're thrilled to be here and then presenting on cyber risk reporting. All right, so first of all, let's start with what exactly is cyber risk reporting and why it is important. So the reason it's important because cyber risk reporting gives our stakeholders and our executive teams actionable insights on what to act upon. And why it is important? Because as you all know, nobody is immune to a breach. It's not a matter of it, but it's a matter of when. So it's our responsibility as cyber practitioners to make sure that we provide our stakeholders with the right information, and that's where the risk reporting comes in. And the next is, as you all know, there's an exponential growth in cyber risk. Every day we hear of new threats, new vulnerabilities that come into the market, so we need to get ahead of it and then also present it in a way to make sure that our stakeholders really understand the underlying risk behind it and act on it. And if the cyber risk is to be realized, as you all know, there is a financial risk to it, there's a reputational loss to it, and we don't want to be in the news. We don't want to be in that situation where we have to defend ourselves. So it's better to get ahead of a cyber risk and really understand how to measure it, how to tackle it, so that we have good defense strategy. And the last point, which is super important, which is around quantifying cyber risk. And the reason it is important because as the stats shows, it is very hard to put numbers behind cyber risk. And that's why we get so many breaches. And if you hear the news, you would hear a headline. They would say, oh, we did not know where the risk was. We didn't know about this asset. Everything fell into a crack. That's where we want to avoid, and that's why cyber risk reporting is super important. Next, we'll go over the underlying aspects of cyber reporting in terms of how risk is measured, how risk is identified and analyzed, so that we can act on it. So first of all, risk identification. So identifying risks we have to understand what are the real emerging and the new risks that we have in an organization. And the risk varies depending on what organization you have. Financial services will have very different for healthcare. So depending on what sector you have, so you have to make sure you identify your risk really well. You need to understand them so that you can prepare a full-rounded strategy around it. The next would be the risk assessment. So risk assessment helps us prioritizing risk according to your organization. With risk assessment, we do like multitude of ways, like we do questionnaires, we do assessments to understand where our risk is and what's our current score is, and then what are we targeting at. The next is risk measurement, which is super important around key indicators. So key indicators tell us, okay, where do we need to put our effort at? And then we'll go over in the key indicators in detail in the next section. Reporting framework is also very important because it gives us a consistent approach on reporting our numbers to our stakeholders, to our board of directors, to our executives, and something to track on year over year or quarter over quarter, depending on what your organization's cadence. Stakeholder communication, as you all know, in cybersecurity, we produce so many different reports depending on what our stakeholders are, so depending on the IT team to the board. So it is very important for us to really understand how to tailor and slice and dice our data to present to the right audience. The next is continuous monitoring. So as you know, risk reporting is a continuous process, and then we We go over the regular monitoring and updates to understand where our risks are, and then what's our journey and strategy for cyber risk reporting. Next up, we'll go into the approaches for cyber risk reporting. So there are two ways we can report the cyber risk. So first is the top-down, another is bottom-up. There are two different ways. You must have heard it in your organizations that we do top-down, bottom-up, and then both have a lot of value in how we report the metrics. And then, because combining both the approaches, we get to a level where we understand what's coming from the senior management, what's our strategy. And in the bottoms-up approach, we talk about how are we tracking those numbers at an asset level. We talk about how many vulnerabilities we have in a system. And you must have heard executives would say, oh, we want 0 vulnerability solved in a couple of days. That's where the bottoms up is. And then we work with the systems to gather the approach, and then that's how we go into tops down and bottoms up approach. And next, I'll pass on to Roopam to talk about the developing metrics for cyber risk reporting.
Thanks, Neetika. Let's skip over. So for the purpose of our presentation today, we're going to focus on top-down risk reporting. As everybody knows, bottom-up is very effort-extensive. We tend to focus on our key most assets. It's not completely program-wide because the resource efforts and so on required to do a bottom-up risk reporting is way higher than top-down. So for the purpose of this presentation, we'll focus on top-down risk reporting, which relies heavily on developing metrics for cyber risk reporting. So we'll get into the approach for developing successful metrics. So there are 7 key steps that we recommend when defining metrics for cyber risk reporting. The very first one, before we even pick and choose what metrics fit our purpose, is to define what really is the objective and the goal for developing a metrics program. So this information we typically get from our senior leadership because you want it to be tied to your business goals and strategies. So what really is the business concerned about? And then from cybersecurity perspective, what are the risks that leadership wants to prioritize? So identifying that would be the key first step. Defining the risk objectives would really just funnel from business corporate goals and objectives. So once we've done that step, we should then see, okay, what are the metrics that would help us measure our control effectiveness, our program effectiveness against those risk scenarios and objectives that we've defined in the first step. So we look at, we can look at a KRI catalog, KPI catalog, and see, there's never-ending number of metrics that you can pick and choose, but to right fit it and to customize it to our organizational needs, it'd be very crucial to look at what are the goals and the objectives in step 1. So step 3 is developing strategies for generating the metrics. So yeah, it would be great and really fun to have a number of metrics that we think, oh, we need to focus on this, it would feed into this risk scenario, we definitely need to measure this on whatever cadence, but it has to be realistic, it has to be credible. So on the third step, we would brainstorm with our cyber IT team and see the metrics that we have outlined that are supporting our risk objective and scenarios are actually realistic, and there's a way, whether it's manual or automated, that we can actually gather the data that would help us measure this metric. The next step would be establishing our benchmarks and targets, so which goes hand in hand into the thresholds that would define what is a red, yellow, and green, basically what is a high risk, what is a medium risk, and what is a low risk. The next step we have is determine how the metrics will be reported. So this is where we define the cadence of the reporting itself. We define what are the different dashboard views we want. So we'll have different audiences within the organization that this will feed into. So we'll have our business stakeholders. We will have our operational team. So we'll have reporting done on a more frequent basis for our IT and cyber team. But for the executives and leadership and other business leaders, would not have it at such a frequent basis. So the views would vary based on our audience. So we'd have more static metrics for our leadership, but the more dynamic ones for our IT and cybersecurity team, that's the operational dashboard, because those numbers would change more frequently and would be discussed on a weekly or monthly basis. So the next step we have is creating the action plan and acting on it. So yeah, we've created our program, we've done our cyber risk reporting, we gathered all the data. Now what about it, right? So at this step, we're trying to see, we've established the cadence, we've identified all these risks, they're logging into a risk register, and what is the action plan though? How are we remediating it? And the very last one is establishing a formal program review cycle. So this is for the overall program itself. It's not for a particular security domain or related to a finding. It's more so how effective is our cyber risk reporting, how effective is our metrics program, and do we need to change the metrics? Is our data credible? Where are we having these issues? Are the reports that we're generating, the dashboards that we're producing, are they digestible to the different audiences we're targeting? So that would be the very last step. Now moving on to just a very brief overview on what's the relationship between key indicators, metrics, and data. So these are definitions that we're going from ISF. So key indicators would basically, it could be very high level and would be a combination of different metrics involved. So for key indicators, we can have how well is a third-party risk management program, and a number of different metrics would feed into it. So we could have how many high-risk third parties have been assessed, how many total third parties have been assessed, how many gaps related to third parties have been remediated on a timely basis. So there is a combination of these metrics will feed into the broader key indicator. And then data is at the very bottom of this pyramid because we have to rely on our tools or we have to rely on our manual processes to gather the data that would feed into this reporting. We also wanted to touch upon, the difference between a KPI and a KRI. So a lot of times we work with organizations, and as we're working with them to build the dashboards, they confuse the concept of a KPI and a KRI, and they want to overlap one with the other, and try to change it interchangeably, use it interchangeably. But we just want to delineate between a KPI and a KRI. So a KPI, basically the objective of KPI is to measure the performance, measure the maturity of our program, measure performance of a tool, of our processes, how efficiently we're working, not necessarily what is the risk. So KRIs are dedicated just to identify and monitor potential risks and threats to the organization, identify early warning signs of potential risks that could impact the achievement of our corporate objectives. So for an example, we can look at a KPI would be, did our risk assessors complete cyber risk assessments in a timely basis? Whatever budget we had allocated for them, whatever hours we had allocated for them, was that achieved in a timely basis? That would really tell you the efficiency of the program. But from a risk standpoint, we don't necessarily care about how long or short it's taking, but rather that the risks are effectively identified, managed, and tracked and reported on. So this is really just the key differentiator between a KPI and a KRI. So when we're concentrating on cyber risk reporting, it's very crucial to pick the right metrics for our program. So I will just glance over it because a lot of this content I had covered already. So this is again just an approach to define the metrics. So we'd just like to reiterate. So when it would be good to pick a smart approach on picking and choosing the right metrics. So be specific with what the metric is trying to achieve. So some of the questions you can ask yourself is, what is being measured? Why is it being measured? Who or what is involved in this measurement? We want to make sure the metric itself is measurable. So for example, if we're taking third party again, so we're saying, okay, how many of our high risk third parties are assessed? But if we don't have a certification criteria, if we're not tiering our vendors, we don't have that sophistication in our program right now, we cannot have that data handy. So we just want to make sure the metrics that we're picking are measurable. They should also be realistic based on the available resources, constraints, and timeframes. So if our GRC team is already overwhelmed, we cannot perform that third-party tiering, we don't even have a framework to do third-party tiering, then that metric may not be a very achievable goal. We also want to make sure the metric is repeatable. You could change the cadence. It depends on organizational appetite. You could measure a metric on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, semi-annually, whichever fits best for the organization needs. And we should also ensure the metric is time dependent, so we can read the trends, monitor the trends, and then have a feedback loop into our program and make changes, the necessary changes we need to make. Okay, we'll hand it over to Neetika.
Yeah, thank you. And next, we'll go over the metrics and dashboards that matter. So you have heard the why it's important, and then how it is measured. And then the next part is how do you display it so that it's easily digestible for all the audience, for your executives and your teams, to make sure that we understand the risk really well. So first of all, the examples of metrics in cybersecurity programs. So I have a couple of examples here. So first of all, the vulnerability management metrics. So vulnerability is a space that we are all familiar of as cybersecurity practitioners. The number of the metrics that we identify around vulnerabilities are like how many vulnerabilities we have, what's the time we take to patch the vulnerabilities, and what's the patch coverage, meaning do we have scanners available on every single asset. So these are the metrics around vulnerabilities that we absolutely need to track to understand what's the risk we have in our VM space. The next is security operations centers metrics. So every organization has security operations. It's a way to respond to any incident or to make sure that we have good coverage. So number of alerts. So this metrics is about number of alerts, meaning what's our effectiveness of our controls that we have in our system. The false positive rate, whether whatever we are tracking, are they giving us the right information? If there are too many false positive rates, that would mean we're spending too much time in tracking a wrong thing, so which would mean we have to tune our systems to get to the right level of information. The mean time to investigate, which would mean that how efficient we are in getting to the root cause of a problem, because as you all know, right, these days we have regulations that ask us to report an incident within 72 hours, 48 hours, and the grand scheme of things is not a lot of time when we are working towards a incident. The incident response metrics, so mean time to detect. So it would be how long does it take for us to detect, which ties back to how efficient our systems are, what's our response capacity. Mean time to respond, how do we respond to an incident, and the number of incidents. So for the metrics track the number of security incidents that has occurred in a quarter, in a month, over a year. So that's a key metric that an organization really tracks to understand, are they in a range where it's acceptable? Do teams have enough capacity to work on them? So those are incident response metrics. The next is user awareness metrics. So this comes under the governance, and then just to make sure that everybody in a company knows what security is and how to make informed decisions around security hygiene. So phishing click rate. So all organizations, they do have phishing campaigns, and then they track those numbers just to see whether employees are cognizant and vigilant of what emails they get, and they're not clicking any phishing emails. Training completion rate, which is, I'm sure, all the companies have its mandatory annually, semi-annually. And then the help desk tickets related to security, just to see whether there are any security incidents or not. And the next is the compliance metrics, so policy adherence. So as different organizations have different adherence to the policies and standards. Compliance violations. So if you're in a team where you have to apply for an exception, that's a compliance violation, and we have to track it because we have to see what other control we have, which we call a compensating control, if we are not in the if we are violating our compliance. And that next is the audit findings. So we have internal and external audit. So they measure the program against what policies you have, what compensating controls you have, and then see what's the residual risk that you are left with. So that's where the audit findings come in. And the next view I have here is around different types of strategic lens that you would see in an organization around program maturity, and then different methods, how you get to a program maturity, and then what are the different metrics you track. So for a program maturity, you can do a self-assessment, and then that would be around the maturity score, and then that could be based on CMMI scale, the NIST. Any one of you can tell me if it's a top-down or bottoms-up program maturity? Anyone in the audience? It's top down. Perfect. The risk management, it's a questionnaire just to understand where our risks are. The critical assets migrated to a secure vendor network. So in any organization, we have a book of our critical assets, which means making sure that these are the assets which we absolutely need to protect. And then critical systems that are end of life. This is critical because sometimes we forget, oh, it's end of life, we don't have to do anything about it, but if you ask the end-of-life teams, there is so much things to do after that to make sure that no data is on those assets. And the next is around incident readiness, which is simulation exercises. So this is just to make sure whether our incident teams have the muscle memory to respond to an incident, in order to engage all the stakeholders, because in the event of an incident, we have to make sure we have right people on the table to voice out certain different things. There could be a litigation matter, there could be a communication piece, there has to be a teams on the ground to find the root cause. So all of the teams have to come together and work on an incident. And simulation exercises are one of the best ways to test your teams for that. The next one is sample reporting. So I have a couple of views here. So the first is risk heat map. I'm sure most of you must have seen this thing. So it's just a visual representation of cyber risk based on their likelihood and impact. The red is a no-no zone. So you shouldn't have, all the risks need to be figured out first. You have to have a plan on how to mitigate those risks. And the next is the vulnerability assessment report. So it's just how many vulnerabilities you have, how many do you need to solve now. And the next is around the third-party risk assessment, it's a simple report to evaluate what are, like a notification or information on our vendors, suppliers that we have, or partners and their security posture. Because in the third-party world, it's our risk, but also the company we're partnering with, their risk is our risk, so we need to understand what their risk is, and that's why the third-party tiering, the third-party profiling gets super important. I have this sample executive dashboard. So this is a dashboard that an executive team is super interested in. And there are a couple of metrics that they like to see at the top senior management level. So for example, is the risk level and the risk mitigation. So just to understand like whether we are investing our money into the right fields or not. If something is in the right malicious insider, do we have enough tools to make sure that we have enough coverage to get those use cases resolved? The risk scenarios here, so just to understand, every organization has certain risk appetite, and based on the risk appetite, we define the risk scenarios. And there's an underlying data that we can use to have a metric around the risk scenario, and then do the current risk status and the trending as well. And the next is sample operational dashboard. So this is where we go into nitty-gritty of our tools. So for example, here you would see the number of critical and significant risks identified through cybersecurity and privacy assessment, so you can track it over time just to see where an organization needs to mature, where they are at. The next is email filtering. So number of identified spam and phishing email. This is a super common graph that you would see an operational team to track, because phishing is, as you know, is one of the easiest attack. The critical vulnerabilities based on CVSS that do not have remediation plans and patches. The data protection, that's to understand how many devices that are not compliant with data protection rules, the backup failures, and then the key detective indicators. The number of, for example, here, the number of incidents not meeting our SLAs, which means we are slow. We need to invest into training our response teams to make sure that we hit that SLA at the right time. And next up, we have a case study that Roopam will walk you through, and this is a group activity. So our PwC team will facilitate that exercise for you.
Thanks. Okay, we got some homework for everyone here. So the case study we have here is there's a Canadian financial services-based startup named Prosper Inc. They have received $50 million from investors to grow and expand in different geographies across Europe, South America. Now, the board has asked the executive team at the organization to build cybersecurity metrics and report on cybersecurity maturity. Currently, the cybersecurity program, within the cybersecurity program, they have a solution to scan for vulnerabilities. They have application security tools. They're also planning to subscribe to threat intelligence portal. So now the activity, and this is the homework for everyone, is to, could you help the security team here at Prosper Inc. to come up with some relevant metrics to help do the reporting for the upcoming board meeting based on these details that we've shared here. And we'll also pause for any questions, any assumptions. Yeah.
So just in terms of like privacy legislation, just taking a look at the new privacy legislation, which would impact compliance and privacy teams within the organization, to then take a look at if they're scanning for the right threats, if it's current.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. How do we want to give out everyone paper and then have, so
Yeah.
we still have time for a Q&A, so we just want to like have everybody do a little bit of this activity and then we'll discuss it as a group and then we'll segue into our Q&A.
Yeah.
Does that sound like a plan?
Yeah.
Awesome,
Yeah, we'll give
awesome.
everybody 10 minutes
Yeah.
to brainstorm, and then
We have a big group, so let's just, the point of today is to network as well, right? So please interact with some other folks that you haven't met yet. Let's get together and work on this case study. If you have any questions, feel free to put your hand up and one of the PwC reps will come and help. Okay? Sound good? All right, so maybe get into good, yeah, we need more energy now. We're on fire. But I know it's lunch in the next 30 minutes, but let's get into groups of like, I don't know, like 7, 8, maybe 10, maybe even the rows can be weird.
yeah, the
Yeah,
rows.
I think the rows will be,
The
yeah.
rows are better.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'll give it. If you guys have pens, please take them out because someone stole my pen. All right, here. You ladies want some paper?
One. Oh, I have a pocket. Okay.
And
Great presentation. I wanted to ask you something. Can we get a copy of the slide deck because we couldn't take any of the photos and we couldn't see the text? How can we get a copy of it?
I
we
think we'll
can
talk
get back to you on
yeah,
that.
I think we'll talk to the organizers, and yeah, we'll talk to
Yeah.
the organizers.
Yeah, we'll-
and then
PwC booth? Where will we go? Which booth will we go?
Which picture do you want? We can.
I think PwC, yeah. I think PwC booth should be fine.
PwC
yeah, we'll
booth.
be there after the workshop so we can connect with you.
Oh. Should let's walk around.
Okay?
I think it's okay. I think it's okay, right?
Yeah.
Would the AV people have problem?
Huh?
Should be okay, right? Because they're live streaming everything. What do you think? Should we go?
No, actually, we should. Let's just stay.
It's a live stream. Oh. Okay. 5 more minutes.
We should have done Q&A first. Get some water. I'm gonna get some water.
We should get a picture together later at the PwC booth with our presentation. Okay. Five more minutes.
Yeah.
No, no, we're
No,
good.
no, no.
Question, is it the session until 12:15, right?
Yeah.
So, okay. Yeah. I think it was 11:35 to 12:15, right? Yeah.
It's still 15, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So maybe in a couple minutes.
Yeah, like
Give them
5 minutes. Just see. The,
Schedule 12:30.
oh, good. We have time.
You guys killed it. Great job. I love it.
Oh, thanks.
I think we should have done QA before we did.
Oh. Now they're not gonna like listen.
Yeah, exactly.
They're just leaving.
Is there a right or wrong answer for this? Or
No,
kind of
no,
just
no, no.
discussion?
Yeah, we're just gonna like collectively, right? Figure it out.
Then if someone needs to present, we'll ask.
I didn't expect so many people.
We're standing. Oh. Oh, Lena will come here.
Maybe.
Stand in the middle.
You good?
I can ask the DJ if they have some kind of like bell
Music,
to
like
stop.
5 minutes. Give 5-minute
Have
warning.
something like a ding 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 ding. Or you
No,
guys
no, I
just
think
gonna
we'll
stay
just
at
move
Say,
on. How much time? I was thinking we can also ask them if somebody wants to share their pen friends. Right, within the organization.
This group.
How long for today?
How long? I was looking at the time at all times. 5 minutes. Two more minutes and then we'll.
I think we should get started and then we'll ask them to like chime in as well, like what are their pains in their current organization and then how we can help answer this.
You wanna go ahead?
All right, I guess if everyone's ready, I think we can try to regroup and.
All right, everyone.
Hello. Are we good? Are we good? Can I get a thumbs up from everyone? Are we good to go? Good to discuss? Everybody has sufficient time? Okay. Awesome, awesome. So we would like to call for volunteers who would love to share their thoughts, and I guess we can discuss, what are the wonderful things that you've jotted down, and then, if any recommendations that we have from our side, from experience, we can have that discussion as well. Any volunteers?
Yeah.
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 A few of the things that were brought up were, employee training could be good metrics to look at, like what courses is the.
Oh, we have a mic. Oh.
So employee training metrics, what training courses are taken, which are mandatory amongst the population of the organization, what's the uptake, are they actually completing it? phishing simulations could be something that would be good to start doing as well. Measuring successful reporting, this is phishing, or actually clicking on it and getting phished. Vulnerability scanning, so the coverage on the system. So they mentioned that there is vulnerability scanning happening, but what is the coverage, the different system breakdown, the severity of the alerts? And then threat intelligence, maybe the regions that are noted there, is there anything happening in those regions that it can be metrics reported on, as well as it being the financial sector, what type of attacks or threat scenarios are impacting.
Perfect. That's awesome. Thank you. Who else? Monica?
I was with all the PwC experts over here. So we thought your slide, I think you, okay, yes. So I was with all the PwC experts here, so we had lots of great ideas. We took inspiration from one of your slides that I thought covered it really, really well. So we kind of broke it up into AppSec metrics, compliance, security operations, governance, and then an overall program maturity score.
Yeah.
So governance, we thought, even though you didn't mention it, phishing and awareness, I think you also mentioned it, is a great start. Compliance, we thought understanding laws, privacy, regulation, obligations would be great because we're in a multi-geographic area. SecOps, the mean time to recover, mean time to identify, of course. Vulnerability, we thought about percentage of assets scanned, severity, mean time to patch, mean time to remediate, and then we thought like an overall program maturity, if they use NIST framework or something, that might not be updated every year, but then at least maybe on a 2 or 3 year annual cycle, it's something that can be tracked. So.
As a starting point, yeah. That's good. That's good.
That's
awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Yeah, so those have been excellent. They've covered off most of ours. But there was a couple we were going to mention. One is training completion, because it's a new area, probably new employees. You want to see their training. And also the number of incidents. They didn't have threat intel, but it'd be good to see what kind of incidents they had.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome.
Thank you.
Any other volunteers? Please, Janet, go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to cover something that other teams haven't yet. So we also had backups in place. So RTO, RPOs, those metrics are also important. For vulnerability and threat management, we also have false positives and false negatives. Patch cadence is also important. And trying to see what else wasn't covered yet. Yeah, and any security awareness and privacy metrics.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you.
Just a general direction, right? So I think we have a lot of good coverage in terms of like what are the metrics that we should be picking. Just a few suggestions in the way, like the line of thinking, right? So you can even first just look at, okay, what is the industry sector, right? And what really matters most to the business. A lot of folks mentioned compliance. Even if they were not operating out of other geographical locations, even within Canada, they would have some, from financial standpoint, it could be OSFI requirements that they have to abide to, right? And then we look at, okay, what are the privacy requirements as well, not only within Canada, but also across the other geographies. And some of the risk scenarios, right, we could have is theft of data, right, manipulation of data, because it's an FS as well, so they would have concerns around financial reporting, so integrity of data would also matter a lot, availability of data. So I think the metrics that everybody picked they were great, the coverage was great. It's just a line of thinking. It would be good to connect the dots from like, what is the nature of the services delivered, where are they currently, where are they trying to expand to, what will be the highest priority for the leaders, yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Okay. I also just wanted to encourage everyone to ask any questions, any areas we may not have covered during our presentation, and also, welcome everyone if they've encountered any issues in the past for cyber risk reporting within their organization, with their leaders or their, business stakeholders, that we could perhaps help or give any recommendations on how to manage that situation better. So, would appreciate any volunteers, any questions. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I think that we didn't cover that an organization currently faces. I work in breach and cyber risk, and I think we see that as an incident response person for TransUnion. And what we see is that there's not enough reporting on the number of breaches within, not just financial services, but organizations across the board, and then taking a look at other organizations within the same industry that have not necessarily responded well in a breach and what not to do. So if we take FS, for example, there's financial institutions that were massively hit in 2018, not to name names, but that changed the precedent of how we respond to a breach or an incident. So just taking from that, what are you guys seeing in terms of metrics in the incident response? And as we said, I think you mentioned end life, but and there's so much work to do. So what kind of metrics do you guys generally see, or what do you see organizations doing in that point?
Do you want to take that?
I can go first. So based on the breaches that had happened in the past, what I've seen organizations do, so just do like a quick study on their systems as well. So for example, if the same thing has to happen to them, what would be their gaps? And then how would they identify those gaps and create a plan to mitigate those risks? Because if one organization is breachable, I'm sure others are as well. So I think that's one of the things that I've seen. It's very effective, and that's how you roll it up to your cybersecurity strategy, get your executives buy-in as well into that. So I've seen, it's mostly driven by the risk management team. So that has been very effective.
And just to add on, so I think it's also important to the translation of risk, right? Because a lot of times, I've seen organizations, right, they struggle with the concept of a control gap and a risk, right? So we're saying we're going to lead, and more so for leadership, right? Because they don't have cyber risk expertise, right? They're looking at a lot of things. So if we're saying, okay, we have a gap in this domain, what does that really mean? We have all these vulnerabilities. Okay, what does that really mean? Do I need to do anything about it? In the control gap sense, you don't really need to do anything about it because it's just a gap. But then when you translate it to risk, right, I think that translation is very important, especially for leadership to prioritize it and invest in it. So one way you can go about it, and we had a client have this ask in the dashboard, when we were developing the dashboard, was how do I embed the threat lens, right? Because we're saying, yeah, we have internally these gaps, but then this is a likelihood of us getting hit, right? Just having the vulnerability, like the control gap, is not really necessarily an issue. But if there's threats out there that we have to worry about, and then we have a gap, so a combination of that is okay, a residual risk, right? So one way you can go about it is, when you define those risk objectives, you can map the threats. So as a starting point, you can get a list of threats from ISF, or you could do a threat profiling exercise for your organization, identify the top 10 threats, map it to the risk objectives, right? Have some measurements and data, if you have the threat intel feeds and so on coming, you can have the rating for the threat likelihood occurring for your particular organization. And then you see from metric standpoint, how are your controls operating against that threat? And if they're not operating well, and the threat likelihood is high, and their control gap is also high, that means their residual risk is high. And then you can translate that in terms of your financial impact, your regulatory impact. And that would be one way to translate, a gap to risk for the leadership for business. Because standalone, not having instant reporting, that's not going to be a concern for them. But when you translate it to risk, it would be more of an issue, yeah. Oh, they're just getting mic, sorry.
So just a question, to start from the blank, can we use the critical security controls like SANS have top 20 critical security control, and develop our metrics based on those things, or do some kind of a gap assessment and develop the metrics based on that one? Would that be good for some kind of new organizations to identify where they need to invest and all those things?
So, sorry, the question is just that, how do we prioritize those metrics, or?
Yeah, the question is, if we are a new organization, to start with something where we can do a gap assessment,
yeah,
using the SANS top 20 security control and develop the metrics based on that one,
yeah,
because that would help you to take care of the most of the vulnerabilities which
yeah,
are critical to address, right?
yeah.
And that that might be the first starting point to do a gap assessment using that one and develop the metrics using those controls.
Yeah, and I think like I would still bring it back to the whole risk lens, right? Like, what are the areas you want to care about? Like a healthcare, organization will care about health data. Like personal information, health data is very scarce. It's very important. But priority from, let's say, consumer market organization or NFS organization may vary. Priority for a service provider, maybe availability will be like top notch, right? So I think looking at those like risk objectives and then seeing what are the metrics we need to really care about, right? Because if you're focusing too much on, let's say, if you go about NIST framework, right? If you're spending a lot of time on detect, but then not so much on recover, but then the key objective for your business is to be up and running, right? The appetite for availability is very low, like you have to be available all the time, and you're not measuring that, right? Then you have a disconnect between the cyber IT team and what the leadership wants, what they want to prioritize. So I would still, I think the source of indicators, I think you mentioned is great. It's just, when I would personally pick and choose, I would make sure I have coverage across multiple domains and that they tie back to what is the risk objective, what are we trying to measure, and not also overwhelm our team, right? Because you can have a set of like 50 metrics, but do we have the bandwidth to go and, and do you even have sources to feed that data, right?
It should be.
It's both, right? So your corporate objectives would define where the organization wants to go in the next 5 years, 3 to 5 years, what is a priority? And then cybersecurity team would define, okay, what are the risks associated with these corporate objectives? And then you would define your metrics and your program around it, yeah.
Yeah, we have one more question, 2 more questions.
What are the best practices in collecting data? Do teams, because each team will have their own repository, they're using a VM tool or an application security team has their own data. When it comes to bubbling this up to a higher level, what's the best practice in bringing all this data together? Because it could be in a database, it could be in a spreadsheet, it could be in somebody's head.
So for that, I would say the first goal, so for example, if an executive wants to see that view, there is a voice that needs to come from top down that we need to have consistency and uniformity across all our data sources. I think that's the number one thing that the teams want to hear. And then also working with the teams, building relationships with them to make sure that we get on the same platform, because in the end, it's all about getting those insights and provide actionable insights to our leadership to get right investments into our teams, into our tools. And for example, we need a different solution altogether that merges all the data that different teams are collecting and rolling up into a view that is digestible to the executive team. Do we have time for one more question? I saw.
Yeah, I just want to check.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I think it was really well done. My question is also, I think, kind of related to hers. Is how do you efficiently track all these KPIs? Is it a manual process or a monthly thing? What have you seen work for organizations to really ongoingly report and then compile this information?
So I've seen organizations have, their cybersecurity committees, but then they have their working groups that, meet much more frequently, right, on a weekly basis, bi-weekly basis, depending on, the organization's bandwidth and everything. You would typically have a GRC person role, right, coordinating with these leads. So as part of that governance model, you would define that accountability, for this domain, this is the data we need for this particular metric, and who is the owner to give that data. And the GRC person coordinate and would feed in the data and then review on a weekly basis. This is why, when we went through the executive dashboard, the operational dashboard, so the operational dashboard is typically, that more dynamic, right? Because let's say, if you have one on the dashboard, what are the security awareness trainings, that the completion rate for our employees, right? But that's not going to change every week, on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, right? It would probably change quarterly, semi-annually. So you would typically not have that in the operational dashboard. You would have, more stats around open vulnerabilities, the emails, like any malware detected, all that, right? And around incidents. So basically, the GRC role person would have the accountability to gather the data, and then the accountability for individual metric for the particular data would be defined in different like security team member, yeah, and then reviewed on a weekly basis, yeah. Any other questions? I also time check, please. Can somebody?
Yeah, it's 2 minutes.
Okay,
but
we have time.
But yeah, we can have a quick one.
Yeah. Here at the front, yeah.
What is the best way to present the variation in a metric report to the senior manager? Thinking in some variation can be triggered for factors like information security, awareness, for example, in case the incidents, sometimes after the employees know how to report, start to report more, so about how you can show that it's not bad. Maybe it's a good indicator sometimes.
So the question is around how to report an incident?
How to present the variations in metric reports to the when you are presenting to the senior manager. But for example, like I see the incidents, the number of incidents amounts can be increased after you do, for example, awareness.
Oh, so
information security
you're
awareness.
showing the trend,
Yeah,
right? Like we are improving.
So you are waiting maybe reduce, but you have increase, and it's not always a bad thing.
Yeah.
So the tactical answer to that, like what I had done in the past to show the variation, would be like a simple spider chart, where you have your milestone towards the end, and then where your current maturity is towards the inside, and then you see how far you have to go to get to the variation.
Yeah. And you can also have quarter by quarter as well, right? In a different view, that for this KRI, this was the, this is what we measured this versus this and that quarter. And then I think you mentioned around the maturity, right? Like some organizations do have the maturity view that after we've implemented this program, the KRI could be how well we're doing against the roadmap that we had defined. And then, what is the jump in the maturity? So it could be like a combination of these to depict that message. Yeah.
Thank you.
Did we answer the question?
I was thinking more like so you had to explain that because you had a report, but so for example you had to explain why you have some increase in some numbers in the report that could be look like it's bad things, but could be good things, because maybe so for example you have having the same number of incidents amount, but so you do something. So maybe before the employees wasn't reporting the incidents, now they are reporting. So your number increase in the report. It can be look like a bad. You are having more incidents, but you really maybe just don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah. So I think, for example, like that's where I think the program reporting, right? Sorry, we're gonna wrap up quickly. So there's a program reporting. It's a combination of KRI reporting, right, and KPI. So this is the difference between performance and risk, right? So when you have a jump in risk, for example, right, you can also say, look, the program performing well as well, right? So you could have, let's say, if you had no rules in your SIM tool, or they're not fine-tuned, they're out of the box, and now you've done some, investment in your detection capabilities that we're getting more incidents. So yeah, you're gonna see the risk go up, but then you're also saying your performance is going up, right? So those metrics that measure the performance of your program, they should be delineated. So you would have your risk reporting, but you should also have your performance reporting go hand in hand. So you can then justify to the leadership that, yeah, our risk is going, but then we've made all these investments, and now our detection capabilities have matured. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for your time today. It was our pleasure.